47 American soldiers walked into the jungle. 19 walked out. The rest vanished into the green hell, dragged into tunnel networks so deep that recovery teams never found their bodies. And you know what the Pentagon did? They drew a red circle on the map and wrote 3 words, "Off limits, Australian only." Wait, Australians? The guys from the country better known for surfing than soldiering. Those Australians were allowed to operate where United States Special Forces were forbidden to set foot. This story gets so much stranger than you think, because what those Australian operators were doing in those jungles, the methods they used, the tactics they employed, became so effective and so psychologically devastating that American liaison officers were requesting emergency transfers just to get away from them. One Marine observer came back from a joint patrol and submitted a classified report with a conclusion that shook MRCV headquarters. The assessment read, "We thought we were elite. We were wrong." You're about to discover why the most powerful military machine on Earth handed over entire provinces of Vietnamese jungle to fewer than 600 men from a nation most Americans couldn't locate on a globe. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the Viet Cong stopped calling them soldiers and started using a different name entirely. They called them Ma Rung, the Jungle Ghosts. The Phantom Problem. 23 kilometers southeast of the Australian base at Nui Dat, a range of limestone mountains rose from the coastal plains like broken teeth. The Maytao Mountains looked insignificant from the air, just another stretch of jungle-covered karst extending toward the South China Sea. American aerial reconnaissance had photographed every square meter. B-52 bombers had dropped tens of thousands of tons of ordnance on its slopes between 1966 and 1969. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had conducted multiple major operations into its northern approaches. The Marines had sent entire battalions sweeping through its valleys, and yet the Viet Cong's D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion continued to operate from caves and tunnel complexes as if American military power didn't exist. Supply routes remained open. Attacks on Allied positions continued with clockwork regularity. Intelligence reports kept identifying the same enemy units operating from the same general areas month after month, year after year. The mountains had become a festering wound in the American operational plan, a constant reminder that overwhelming firepower couldn't solve every problem. What the Americans didn't understand, what they couldn't grasp through the lens of conventional military doctrine, was that these mountains weren't simply terrain to be conquered. They were a living organism of underground rivers, limestone caverns, and tunnel systems that had been expanded and fortified for 2 decades. The Viet Cong hadn't just dug into these mountains, they had become part of them, moving through the rock like blood through veins. The breaking point came in March of 1967 when a company from the 173rd Airborne attempted what they called a sweep and clear operation through the Maytao's eastern approaches. What unfolded over the following 72 hours would be classified at the highest levels of Military Assistance Command Vietnam. 47 paratroopers entered the jungle. 19 emerged. The rest hadn't been killed by conventional ambush. They hadn't triggered booby traps. They had simply disappeared, pulled from their patrol lines without a sound, their bodies never recovered, their fates unknown. The official after-action report attributed the losses to enemy action and difficult terrain, the kind of bureaucratic language that meant the writers had no idea what actually happened. The classified assessment, circulated only among intelligence officers with top-secret clearances, told a different story. The Viet Cong hadn't fought these Americans. They had hunted them like animals, systematically, patiently, taking them one by one without firing a shot. This was when MACV Command made a decision that would remain buried in archives for 40 years. The Meitao Mountains were declared off-limits to American ground forces, but the tactical problem remained unsolved. D445 Battalion kept launching attacks. Someone had to deal with them, and that someone turned out to be a force so small they barely registered on American organizational charts. The men from down under. To understand why the Pentagon turned to fewer than 600 Australians to accomplish what 20,000 Marines could not, you need to understand the peculiar nature of Australia's military commitment in Vietnam. The first Australian task force had arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 with a mandate that differed fundamentally from American operational doctrine. While United States forces measured success in body counts and kilometers of territory seized, the Australians had been given a single objective: pacify Phuoc Tuy Province using whatever methods necessary. That word, whatever, would prove significant. Within the Australian task force operated a unit so small it barely appeared in American intelligence briefings. The Special Air Service Regiment, 3 squadrons rotating through Vietnam, never more than 150 men in country at any given time. Their official designation was reconnaissance. Their actual function defied easy categorization. The Australian SAS traced its lineage back to the British SAS of World War II, but by Vietnam they had evolved into something distinct. They had fought in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation of the early 1960s, learning to operate in terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 3 meters. They had perfected the art of moving through triple canopy jungle without disturbing a single leaf. They had studied British colonial warfare, Malaysian counterinsurgency, and indigenous tracking techniques that predated European settlement of Australia by 40,000 years. The British SAS had given them their motto, "Who dares wins." The jungle wars of Southeast Asia had taught them what that meant in practice. The difference that changed everything. American military doctrine in 1967 operated on a fundamental principle: find the enemy, fix them in position, destroy them with overwhelming firepower. This approach had won World War II. It had held the line in Korea. It had crushed conventional armies across 3 continents. In the jungles of Vietnam, it had one fatal flaw: you cannot destroy what you cannot see. The Viet Cong understood this intimately. They had studied American tactics for years before the 1st Marine Battalions waded ashore at Da Nang in 1965. They knew Americans moved in large units. They knew Americans made noise. They knew Americans followed predictable patterns and relied on artillery and air support to compensate for tactical limitations. Against such an enemy, the jungle itself became the ultimate defensive weapon. All you had to do was wait, watch, and strike when the Americans were most vulnerable. General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition assumed American superiority in firepower would eventually break North Vietnamese and Viet Cong will to fight. Search and destroy operations sent thousands of American soldiers sweeping through the jungle seeking contact with enemy forces. The theory was simple: kill more of them than they can replace, and eventually they'll stop fighting. The reality proved far more complex. The Viet Cong could break contact whenever they chose, melting into tunnel systems or across borders into Cambodia and Laos. They initiated the fighting on their terms, inflicted casualties, and vanished before American firepower could be brought to bear. Body count became the metric of success, which created perverse incentives. If dead Vietnamese equaled victory, then every dead Vietnamese could be counted as victory, whether they were combatants or not. By 1968, despite killing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, according to official counts, the United States was no closer to winning the war than when major ground operations began. The strategy wasn't working. But in American military culture, when something doesn't work, you don't change the approach. You add more of what you're already doing. More troops, more bombs, more artillery, more helicopters. The solution to every problem was escalation. Australian SAS doctrine inverted every assumption of American warfare. Where Americans moved in platoon or company strength, Australian patrols consisted of 5 men. Where Americans cleared jungle with defoliants and napalm, Australians learned to move through it without disturbing vegetation. Where Americans announced their presence with helicopter insertions and constant radio traffic, Australians walked in from kilometers away, established positions, and waited in absolute silence for days. But the most significant difference lay not in tactics, but in psychology. Australian SAS operators didn't see themselves as soldiers conducting counterinsurgency operations. They saw themselves as hunters, and in hunting, there is no such thing as a fair fight. There is only success or failure, survival or death. The men who could see in the dark. The first documented American observation of Australian SAS methods occurred in June of 1968, when Captain James Morrison, a MACV liaison officer, accompanied a 5-man patrol into the northern approaches of the Maytao Mountains. What he recorded in his classified after-action report would eventually reach the desk of MACV Commander General Crichton Abrams himself. The patrol departed Nui Dat at 3 in the morning, moving on foot through 8 kilometers of rubber plantation before reaching the jungle. Morrison noted immediately that these Australians moved differently than any American unit he had served with. There was no talking, no hand signals, no sound whatsoever. The patrol leader communicated through touch, subtle enough that Morrison missed half the signals, even though he was watching for them. By dawn, they had covered 12 kilometers and established a position overlooking a trail that intelligence suggested served as a supply route for D-445 Battalion. What happened next became the centerpiece of Morrison's report, a document that would circulate through Special Operations Command for the next 2 decades. The Australians didn't set up a conventional ambush. They didn't dig fighting positions or establish fields of fire. Instead, 4 men dissolved into the undergrowth on either side of the trail while the 5th moved forward to examine the path itself. This 5th man was different from the others. His name was never mentioned in Morrison's report, only his role, Aboriginal Tracker. For 20 minutes, the tracker studied the trail. He lowered his face to within centimeters of the ground. He sniffed the air. He touched vegetation with his fingertips, examining leaves and broken twigs with an intensity Morrison found almost disturbing. When he returned, the tracker communicated something to the patrol leader in a whisper so quiet Morrison couldn't hear it, despite being 2 meters away. The Australians began repositioning, moving so slowly they seemed to be engaged in some kind of meditation rather than military operation. 11 hours later, a 3-man Viet Cong courier team walked directly into the ambush position. They never knew the Australians were there until it was too late. The engagement lasted 4 seconds, 3 enemy eliminated, 0 Australian casualties, 0 shots fired that could be heard beyond 50 meters. The Australians had used suppressed weapons and positioned themselves so perfectly that the Viet Cong had no chance to react, no opportunity to return fire, no awareness of danger until death arrived. But this wasn't what disturbed Morrison. What disturbed him came afterward. Standard American doctrine called for immediate extraction following contact with enemy forces. Get in, hit hard. Get out before reinforcements arrive. The Australians operated under no such constraints. Following the ambush, the patrol remained in position for another 6 hours, watching the trail in absolute silence. At 14:30 hours, a second Viet Cong element arrived, 7 men sent to investigate when the couriers failed to report. They found the bodies of their comrades arranged in a specific pattern that Morrison described as ritualistic. The 3 dead couriers had been positioned sitting upright against trees, eyes open, weapons placed across their laps as if they were resting. A playing card, the ace of spades, had been tucked into each man's collar. The psychological effect on the search team was immediate and visible. Even from 50 meters away, Morrison could see terror in their movements. They clustered together rather than spreading out. They made frantic gestures as they tried to comprehend what had happened. One soldier vomited. Another began firing blindly into the jungle, emptying his magazine at shadows. The Australians watched all of this. They didn't engage. They simply observed as the Viet Cong collected their dead and retreated at twice the speed they had arrived, abandoning all tactical discipline. Morrison's report concluded with an observation that would echo through classified intelligence channels for years. Australian SAS does not conduct ambushes. They conduct psychological warfare operations using enemy bodies as the primary medium of communication. Effectiveness unprecedented. Recommend detailed study of methods. Personal recommendation: I do not wish to participate in future joint operations. The Aboriginal advantage. What Morrison had witnessed was the integration of indigenous Australian tracking techniques into modern special operations, a fusion that gave the SAS capabilities no American unit could replicate. The Australian Army had quietly recruited Aboriginal soldiers since the Boer War, recognizing that men whose ancestors had survived in some of Earth's harshest environments for 40 millennia possessed skills that couldn't be taught in military schools. In Vietnam, these skills became devastating force multipliers. Aboriginal trackers could determine the age of a footprint to within hours by examining moisture content in disturbed soil. They could smell a Vietnamese soldier's rice and fish sauce diet from hundreds of meters downwind. They could read the jungle like Americans read newspapers, extracting information from bent grass, broken spider webs, and the flight patterns of birds that would be invisible to Western-trained soldiers. Terry O'Farrell, an Australian SAS soldier who served in Vietnam, later described serving alongside Aboriginal troop members in his memoir. He noted one particular soldier who never used camouflage paint because his natural skin tone already blended perfectly with jungle shadows. This man could track enemy soldiers through terrain where American infrared sensors detected nothing but green blur. The Aboriginal trackers didn't just find the enemy. They predicted enemy behavior, identifying habitual paths through the jungle that Vietnamese forces used the same way animals use game trails. Like any hunter knows, the best place to wait for prey is along these runs, these paths of least resistance through dense vegetation. The Australians didn't attempt to close these paths or ambush every movement. That would have been inefficient. Instead, they selected high-value routes and turned them into killing grounds, striking unpredictably and then withdrawing before enemy forces could respond. The effect wasn't measured in body count, though Australian kill ratios would eventually reach heights that made American commanders question the numbers. The effect was measured in psychological degradation. The long hunt between September and December of 1968, Australian SAS conducted 17 long-range reconnaissance patrols into the Maytau Mountains. The intelligence they gathered filled thousands of pages of classified reports. But more significantly, their presence inside what the Viet Cong considered secure territory had an effect that no amount of B-52 strikes could achieve. The Viet Cong began seeing ghosts. The phenomenon started with sentries reporting movement that left no trace. Guards would hear sounds, a single snapped twig, vegetation rustling, but find nothing when they investigated. Patrol routes that had been used safely for years suddenly became death traps, with soldiers disappearing during routine movements between cave complexes. Captured documents from D-445 Battalion during this period reveal a unit descending into collective paranoia. Log entries described comrades who failed to return from water collection, search parties that found no bodies, no blood, no evidence of contact. Sentries were discovered at dawn with throats cut, killed silently while guards 15 meters away heard nothing. Movement became restricted to daylight hours only. Commanders requested reinforcements. Requests were denied because the area was considered secure from American operations. But the area wasn't secure from Australian operations, and what D-445 Battalion couldn't comprehend was that the men hunting them had learned their craft not from military academies, but from trackers whose ancestors had pursued prey through hostile terrain since before written history began. The Australians operated on a cycle that American forces never attempted. 5-man patrols would insert into enemy territory and remain for periods up to 3 weeks, living off minimal rations, moving only at night or during heavy rain when sound was masked, establishing hide positions so expertly camouflaged that Viet Cong soldiers walked within meters without detecting them. They didn't engage every target they identified. That would have revealed their presence and forced extraction. Instead, they watched, learned patterns, identified high-value targets, and struck with surgical precision before melting back into the jungle. A courier team here, a supply column there, a squad leader separated from his unit, each engagement carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. The playing cards left on bodies weren't random intimidation. They were calculated psychological warfare. Vietnamese culture included strong spiritual beliefs about proper burial and respect for the dead. The Ace of Spades, specifically, had associations with death and bad fortune in Vietnamese folklore. By staging bodies and leaving cards, the Australians weren't just killing enemy soldiers. They were violating cultural taboos, creating the impression of supernatural malevolence. American units tried to replicate this tactic, distributing Ace of Spades cards throughout Vietnam. But they missed the essential point. Leaving a calling card on a body you've killed is theater. Staging that body to communicate a specific message designed to exploit cultural fears and superstitions is psychological warfare. The Australians understood this distinction. Most Americans didn't. The kill ratio. Nobody believed, by December of 1968, D-445 Battalion had effectively ceased offensive operations in areas where Australian SAS was known to operate. Their strength hadn't been significantly reduced. Their supplies remained adequate. Their weapons were functional. But their will had been broken by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand and couldn't fight using conventional tactics. The numbers tell a story that seems almost impossible. Over the course of Australian involvement in Vietnam from 1966 to 1971, the SAS conducted approximately 1,200 combat patrols. They killed at least 500 enemy soldiers in confirmed kills, possibly as many as 600. Their casualties? 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing in action, 1 death from illness, and 28 wounded. The kill ratio exceeds anything achieved by American forces in Vietnam, where conventional American infantry units achieved ratios around 1-to-1, meaning they inflicted approximately equal casualties on the enemy as they sustained. Australian SAS achieved ratios approaching 20-to-1 in some operations. Even American Special Forces, MACV-SOG teams operating in some of the most dangerous missions of the war, couldn't match these numbers. When American commanders first saw these statistics, many dismissed them as inflated or fabricated. The numbers seemed too good to be true, but multiple verification processes confirmed them. The Australians weren't padding body counts. They were simply operating at a level of efficiency that American doctrine hadn't considered possible. The difference lay in philosophy and patience. American forces operated on a cycle of insertion, engagement, and extraction measured in hours or days. Australian SAS patrols operated on a cycle measured in weeks. They would spend 2 weeks gathering intelligence, identifying patterns, learning enemy routines before taking a single shot. When they engaged, it was with complete information about enemy strength, positions, and likely reactions. They weren't soldiers trying to rack up kills. They were hunters who understood that a successful hunt requires patience, preparation, and perfect execution. Miss the shot, and the prey escapes. The hunter goes hungry. In Vietnam, mistakes meant death. So the Australians didn't make mistakes. The training that made ghosts. The transformation of ordinary Australians into jungle phantoms didn't happen by accident. It was the product of a selection and training process so brutal that American observers who witnessed it recommended against attempting replication in United States forces. Australian SAS selection began with psychological evaluation. Candidates were assessed for specific personality traits: high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, exceptional pattern recognition, and something psychologists termed predatory patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining complete situational awareness, the willingness to act with explosive violence after extended periods of inactivity, the capacity to function independently in environments where help was days away. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it successfully. Those who passed entered a training program lasting 18 months, 3 times longer than United States Army Special Forces training of the same era. And, significantly, a portion of that training took place not in jungle warfare schools, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written down, passed instead from generation to generation through demonstration and practice. Physical conditioning was extreme, but not the primary focus. The Australians recognized that any reasonably fit soldier could be made physically stronger. What couldn't be easily taught was the mental discipline required for special operations. Candidates spent weeks practicing movement techniques until they could cross dried leaves without making sound. They learned to control their breathing, their heartbeat, even their scent. They studied animal behavior, learning to recognize alarm calls that indicated human presence. They practiced remaining motionless for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time, developing the patience that would define their operational style. The boot modification that shocked American observers was merely visible evidence of this transformation. Australian SAS operators cut the soles from their standard-issue boots, replacing them with strips of tire rubber shaped to match Vietnamese sandal patterns. From a distance, from a tracking perspective, they didn't leave Australian footprints. They left ambiguous marks that could be anyone, anything, or nothing at all. But the most significant aspect of training was the emphasis on self-sufficiency and initiative. American Special Forces operated with extensive support structures. They had helicopter gunships on call, artillery support pre-planned, extraction options rehearsed. Australian SAS patrols operated on the assumption that they were alone, that help wouldn't arrive, that they would survive or die based entirely on their own decisions and skills. This created a fundamentally different mindset. American soldiers, even elite ones, operated within a system that emphasized following orders and adhering to doctrine. Australian SAS operators were given objectives and left to determine methods. If the mission required spending 3 weeks living in a hole eating cold rations, they spent 3 weeks in a hole. If the mission required walking 80 kilometers through enemy territory, they walked 80 kilometers. There was no questioning, no hesitation, no complaint. They had become something other than conventional soldiers, creatures of the jungle who happened to carry Western weapons, the doctrine that broke convention, understanding why Australian SAS achieved such dramatically superior results requires examining the fundamental differences in how the two forces conceptualize jungle warfare. This wasn't merely a matter of different tactics. It was a complete philosophical divergence in how war should be fought. American military doctrine in the 1960s emerged from victories in World War II and Korea. That doctrine emphasized mass, firepower, and industrial capacity. The American way of war was built on the assumption that superior resources would overwhelm any enemy through sheer volume. More soldiers, more bombs, more artillery, more everything. When something didn't work, the solution was to add more of it until it did work. This approach had crushed Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It had held the line against Chinese human wave attacks in Korea. It reflected American industrial might and organizational capability. Why wouldn't it work in Vietnam? The problem was that Vietnam wasn't Germany or Japan or Korea. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army fought a different kind of war entirely, one that American doctrine wasn't designed to counter. They didn't mass forces for decisive battles where American firepower could destroy them. They avoided direct confrontation, struck when and where they held advantage, and disappeared before American forces could bring their overwhelming firepower to bear. General Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy attempted to force the enemy into decisive battles through sheer persistence. American units would sweep through areas, seek contact with enemy forces, and destroy them with superior firepower. The metric of success was body count, enemy killed in action. If you kill enough of them, eventually they'll run out of soldiers and stop fighting. The strategy had a certain logic. It acknowledged that the United States couldn't conquer North Vietnam without risking Chinese intervention, as had happened in Korea. It recognized that holding territory in a guerrilla war was often impossible. So instead of trying to capture and hold ground, American forces would simply kill enemies until there weren't enough left to fight effectively. In practice, this created perverse incentives throughout the American military. If success meant body count, then commanders were pressured to produce body counts. Units that made heavy contact and inflicted high enemy casualties were considered successful. Units that patrolled for weeks without finding the enemy were considered ineffective, regardless of what intelligence they gathered or how their presence disrupted enemy operations. This pressure to produce numbers led to inflation and sometimes outright fabrication. Civilians killed by artillery or airstrikes in free-fire zones were counted as enemy combatants. Weapons caches discovered were multiplied to produce impressive-sounding totals. Units competing for resources and recognition learned that reporting high body counts led to positive evaluations and career advancement, while reporting low numbers led to questions about competence and aggressiveness. The corruption of body count as a metric went deeper than simple statistics manipulation. It fundamentally shaped how American forces operated. Units became focused on finding and killing enemies, rather than on gathering intelligence or denying enemy access to areas. Patrols that made contact but took casualties were often considered more successful than patrols that avoided contact while gathering valuable intelligence about enemy movements and positions. Australian doctrine emerged from a completely different military tradition. Australia had spent more than a century fighting what they called small wars, colonial conflicts, where they faced enemies that couldn't be defeated through overwhelming firepower because there was no industrial base to overwhelm. The Boer War, the Malayan Emergency, the Indonesian confrontation, in each of these conflicts, Australian forces learned that patience, fieldcraft, and psychological operations could achieve results that artillery barrages could not. The Australian approach to counterinsurgency emphasized understanding and adapting to local conditions rather than imposing preconceived solutions. When Australian forces arrived in Puak Tui province, they didn't immediately begin large-scale operations. They spent weeks studying the terrain, the population, the patterns of enemy activity. They talked to locals, gathered intelligence, built detailed understanding of the operational environment. Where American units measured patrol success in contacts made and enemies killed, Australian units measured success in intelligence gathered and enemy disruption achieved. An Australian SAS patrol that spent 2 weeks observing an enemy supply route without firing a shot was considered highly successful if they returned with accurate intelligence about enemy logistics patterns. That intelligence could then inform larger operations that disrupted enemy capabilities more effectively than random contact would have. The Australian emphasis on reconnaissance over direct action reflected a fundamental understanding that information was more valuable than body count. Knowing where the enemy was, how he moved, what his capabilities were, allowed for efficient targeting that minimized friendly casualties while maximizing enemy disruption. Killing individual enemy soldiers without understanding the larger picture was tactically useless, equivalent to pulling weeds without removing roots. This reconnaissance focus shaped every aspect of Australian SAS operations. Patrols were smaller, typically 5 men, because small groups could move more quietly and remain undetected more easily than larger units. Insertion and extraction were planned meticulously to avoid compromising patrol locations. Once inserted, patrols moved slowly and deliberately, prioritizing concealment over speed. The typical Australian SAS patrol moved perhaps 2 to 3 kilometers per day through jungle compared to American patrols that might cover 10 or more kilometers. This wasn't because Australians were slower, it was because they were thorough. They observed everything, recorded details, built complete pictures of their operational areas. They noted trails and their condition, signs of recent use, defensive positions, likely ambush sites, water sources, anything that might inform understanding of how enemy forces operated in the area. Contact with enemy forces was avoided unless absolutely necessary or unless conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. If a patrol spotted enemy soldiers but wasn't in position to engage effectively, they let them pass and recorded the observation. If conditions were perfect, an isolated enemy element in a location where ambush would be devastating and extraction could be accomplished before reinforcements arrived, then they might engage. But engagement was a calculated decision based on tactical advantage, not an automatic response to enemy presence. This discipline, the willingness to watch enemies pass without shooting them, was perhaps the hardest lesson for soldiers trained in aggressive American doctrine to learn. Every instinct screamed to engage, to fight, to kill the enemy you could see. The Australian approach required suppressing that instinct, recognizing that one enemy killed now might cost the intelligence that could kill 20 enemies later. The patrol cycle reflected this philosophy. Australian SAS patrols typically operated for periods of 10 to 21 days, far longer than American LRRP missions. They carried minimal equipment, just weapons, ammunition, rations, water, communications gear, and observation equipment. No excess weight, no comfort items, nothing that might slow movement or compromise concealment. For the first several days of a patrol, the emphasis was pure reconnaissance, establishing hide positions with perfect camouflage, observing without being observed, building pattern analysis of enemy activity. Only after this reconnaissance phase, only after building complete understanding of the tactical picture, would a patrol consider engaging enemy forces. When they did engage, it was with overwhelming advantage. Perfect ambush positions, complete surprise, overwhelming firepower concentrated in seconds, then immediate withdrawal before enemy forces could react effectively. The goal wasn't prolonged firefights or holding ground. The goal was inflicting maximum disruption with minimum risk, then disappearing before the enemy could organize response. The body display tactics that so disturbed American observers emerged from this psychological operations focus. Australians understood that dead enemies were useful not just for body count statistics, but for the message they sent to other enemy forces. By staging bodies, leaving calling cards, exploiting cultural beliefs and superstitions, they could achieve psychological effects far beyond the tactical impact of the actual casualties inflicted. A Viet Cong soldier who found 3 of his comrades sitting dead against trees with playing cards in their collars didn't just see 3 dead men. He saw something that violated his understanding of how combat worked, something that suggested supernatural involvement, something that made him afraid in ways that ordinary combat death didn't. That fear spread when he reported what he saw. Other soldiers became reluctant to patrol in areas where such things happened. Over time, entire units became degraded by fear of an enemy they couldn't understand or fight effectively. This was warfare at a psychological level that American doctrine rarely attempted. Americans focused on physical destruction, killing enemy soldiers and destroying enemy equipment until the enemy's capability to fight was broken. Australians focused on breaking enemy will, making the enemy afraid to fight, even if he had the capability. The difference in approach produced dramatically different results. American forces could sweep through an area, kill hundreds of enemy soldiers, declare victory based on body count, and return 6 months later to find the same area just as heavily infiltrated by enemy forces. The dead had been replaced. The will to fight remained intact. Nothing fundamental had changed. Australian SAS could patrol an area for several months, kill perhaps dozens of enemy soldiers through carefully planned ambushes and psychological operations, and create a degradation of enemy capability that lasted far longer because they had broken the enemy's willingness to operate in that area. The fear persisted even after the patrols withdrew. This psychological dimension of warfare was something American military culture struggled to implement effectively. There were attempts. The Death Card program distributed Ace of Spades cards to units throughout Vietnam for leaving on enemy bodies. Some American units tried to adopt body display tactics, but these efforts generally failed to achieve the psychological impact of Australian operations because they missed the essential subtlety. Leaving a playing card on a body was theater, showmanship without substance. The psychological impact was minimal because it didn't tap into deeper cultural beliefs or superstitions. It was just Americans doing something weird, but staging bodies in ways that violated Vietnamese cultural norms regarding treatment of the dead, leaving signs that suggested supernatural intervention, exploiting specific superstitions about spirits and bad omens. This created genuine psychological trauma that degraded enemy combat effectiveness. The Australian approach required detailed cultural knowledge that American forces often lacked. It required patience to gather that knowledge and discipline to apply it effectively. It required viewing the enemy not as targets to be destroyed, but as human beings with specific beliefs, fears, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. This was the fundamental difference between American and Australian doctrine. Americans saw warfare as primarily physical, a matter of destroying enemy forces until they couldn't fight. Australians saw warfare as primarily psychological, a matter of breaking enemy will until they wouldn't fight. Both approaches could work in appropriate contexts. In Vietnam, the psychological approach proved far more effective than the physical approach, a lesson that would influence special operations doctrine for decades to come. The American response. When reports of Australian SAS effectiveness began circulating through Mao CV headquarters in 1968, the response was predictable. American commanders wanted to replicate these results with United States forces. If Australians could achieve 20-to-1 kill ratios with 5-man patrols, imagine what Americans could achieve with better equipment, more resources, and larger numbers. The problem was that Australian methods couldn't be simply copied and pasted onto American units. The effectiveness of SAS operations emerged from a specific combination of selection, training, doctrine, and philosophy that had evolved over decades of colonial warfare and jungle operations. You couldn't take conventional American soldiers, give them 2 weeks of additional training, and expect them to perform like Australian SAS. Nevertheless, the attempt was made. Long-range reconnaissance patrol units, LRRPs, were formalized across American divisions in Vietnam. Personnel were sent to the MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang, where instructors, many from 5th Special Forces Group, taught reconnaissance techniques adapted from Australian and British methods. Some LRRP units achieved impressive results. Company E, 52nd Infantry, attached to the 1st Cavalry Division, conducted hundreds of patrols and gathered invaluable intelligence. The unit that would become Company H, 75th Infantry Rangers, served continuously in combat longer than any other Ranger outfit in American military history. Individual LRRP teams developed exceptional skills, learning to move quietly, operate independently, and gather intelligence behind enemy lines. But even the best American LRRP units couldn't match Australian SAS effectiveness for several reasons. First, American units faced constant pressure to produce results quickly. Body count remained the primary metric of success, which incentivized engagement over reconnaissance. Australian SAS could spend 3 weeks gathering intelligence without firing a shot and be considered successful. American LRRPs, who spent 3 weeks in the jungle without contact, would face questions about what they were doing out there. Second, American doctrine emphasized technology over fieldcraft, where Australians relied on human senses and indigenous tracking knowledge. Americans deployed ground sensors, infrared equipment, and electronic surveillance. This technology was useful, but couldn't replace the intimate understanding of terrain and enemy behavior that came from patient observation and study. Third, American units operated within a larger system that valued conformity and standardization. The very things that made Australian SAS effective, their independence, their willingness to operate without support, their flexibility in choosing methods, were seen as potentially dangerous in American military culture. What if units started making their own decisions rather than following orders? What if methods diverged from doctrine? The whole system was built on predictability and control. Australian SAS operated under no such constraints. They were given objectives and trusted to achieve them using whatever methods they deemed appropriate. This produced exceptional results, but required exceptional people, the kind of operators who could function effectively, with minimal supervision, in environments where mistakes meant death. The Ghost Warriors, by the spring of 1969, the Maytau Mountains had effectively become Australian territory, not through conquest, but through psychological dominance. The Viet Cong remained in their cave complexes, but they operated under severe restrictions. They refused to patrol in areas where Australian SAS had been reported. They restricted movements to daylight hours and large groups. They abandoned supply routes that had been used for years. Their combat effectiveness had been degraded not through attrition, but through terror. The evidence appeared in captured documents, interrogation reports, and observable changes in enemy behavior. D445. Battalion had been neutralized without being destroyed. Their soldiers were too frightened to execute orders. Their commanders issued directives that went ignored because subordinates wouldn't enter the jungle. Political officers struggled to maintain morale when men were disappearing from positions that should have been secure. To the Viet Cong soldiers operating in Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australian SAS weren't soldiers in any conventional sense. They were Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, supernatural entities that could appear from nowhere, kill without sound, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. The rational part of these soldiers' minds understood they were fighting well-trained commandos. But after watching friends disappear, after finding bodies staged in ways that violated every cultural norm, after experiencing the constant psychological pressure of never knowing when death might arrive, rationality gave way to superstition. This was psychological warfare at its most effective. The Australians hadn't broken D445 Battalion's physical capability to fight. They had broken something more fundamental, the willingness to enter the jungle, to take risks, to operate aggressively. And once that willingness was gone, all the weapons and training in the world couldn't restore it. The cost of becoming predators. But success in Vietnam came at a price that Australian authorities would spend decades attempting to minimize. The men who learned to hunt humans in the Vietnamese jungle didn't simply return to normal civilian life when their tours ended. They carried something with them, a psychological adaptation to violence that civilian society couldn't accommodate. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually exceed those of their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The same transformation that made them devastatingly effective operators made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to think like predators, to view the world through the lens of threat assessment and tactical advantage. They had become comfortable with violence in ways that civilian society found disturbing. They had spent months living at the absolute edge of human endurance, where every decision meant life or death, where mistakes had immediate and permanent consequences. Normal life, with its mundane concerns and trivial problems, seemed almost incomprehensible after that. Many struggled with the transition. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to manage the psychological weight of what they had done and seen. Some experienced rage that erupted without warning, violence simmering just beneath the surface. Some simply withdrew, unable or unwilling to engage with people who couldn't understand what they had experienced. The Australian government, like most governments dealing with returning veterans, was unprepared for this challenge. Programs existed to help with physical injuries, but the invisible wounds of psychological trauma received minimal attention. Veterans were expected to reintegrate quietly, to put their service behind them and move forward. Many couldn't. The predators they had become in Vietnam couldn't transform back into civilians simply because the war had ended. The legacy. The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam wasn't completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops departed. Classified top secret and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, the report reached conclusions that contradicted fundamental assumptions about counterinsurgency warfare. First, small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. The Australian SAS kill ratio of approximately 20-1 compared to American averages around 1-1 demonstrated this conclusively. Second, indigenous tracking methods, specifically Aboriginal techniques adapted to jungle warfare, provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Proposals to recruit Native American trackers for similar programs were submitted but never seriously implemented. Third, psychological warfare operations targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep and clear operation. Fourth, and most controversially, Australian methods achieved these results partly by operating under fewer restrictions than American forces. The classified annex noted that certain Australian practices regarding treatment of enemy dead and conduct of psychological operations would likely violate MACV directives if conducted by United States personnel. This final point ensured the report remained classified for decades. The Pentagon had no interest in publicizing that their most effective allies in Vietnam had succeeded partly by doing things American forces were prohibited from doing. The political implications were too dangerous. The moral implications were too uncomfortable. Better to let the Australian contribution fade into historical obscurity, remembered only by veterans who had served alongside them. Today, special operations forces around the world study Australian SAS methods from Vietnam as examples of unconventional warfare at its most effective. The tracker programs, the psychological operations, the long-range patrol doctrine have all been incorporated into modern special forces training. What was once classified as too controversial to acknowledge has become standard curriculum at Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, and naval special warfare facilities. Yet something essential has been lost in translation. Modern special operations can replicate Australian tactics. They struggle to replicate Australian psychology, the transformation that turns ordinary people into apex predators, the willingness to become something other than conventional soldiers, the acceptance that effective hunting requires becoming a hunter in your soul, not merely in your training. The question that remains. The story of Australian SAS in Vietnam forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about military effectiveness, human transformation, and the true cost of creating elite warriors. The Australians achieved results that American forces with vastly greater resources and numbers could not match. They did this through superior training, better tactics, indigenous knowledge, and psychological warfare that exploited enemy fears and cultural beliefs. But they also did it by becoming something that civilian society struggles to accommodate, by transforming themselves into predators who viewed human beings as prey, by cultivating a capacity for violence and patience that made them effective killers but difficult veterans. The numbers tell part of the story. 1,200 patrols, 500 to 600 confirmed enemy killed, casualties measured in single digits, kill ratios approaching 20 to 1 in some operations. From a purely military perspective, this represents devastating effectiveness, the kind of return on investment that military planners dream about achieving. But statistics cannot capture the human dimension of what this effectiveness required. To achieve these results, Australian SAS operators had to transform themselves at a fundamental psychological level. They learned to move through the jungle for weeks at a time, living on minimal rations, sleeping in holes, watching enemy soldiers walk past meters away without reacting. They developed patience that approached the inhuman, waiting days for the perfect moment to strike. They became comfortable with violence in ways that civilian society cannot accept, viewing the death of other human beings as simply another tactical problem to be solved efficiently. This transformation served them well in Vietnam. It made them devastatingly effective operators who achieved strategic results far beyond what their small numbers suggested should be possible. But it created challenges that would haunt many of them for decades after the war ended. The veteran who can wait motionless in a hide position for 12 hours watching enemy movement cannot easily adjust to sitting in an office handling paperwork. The operator who learned to make split-second life-or-death decisions in conditions of extreme stress cannot easily defer to civilian authority or accept bureaucratic inefficiency. The hunter who spent months in the jungle where every sound and movement carried tactical significance cannot easily tune out those instincts in environments where such awareness is unnecessary and sometimes detrimental. Australian Vietnam veterans experienced post-traumatic stress rates that exceeded their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer physical casualties. The transformation that made them exceptional soldiers created psychological adaptations that civilian life couldn't accommodate. Some struggled with anger that erupted without warning. Some withdrew into isolation, unable or unwilling to engage with people who couldn't understand what they had experienced. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to manage the psychological weight of memories that wouldn't fade. The Australian government, like most governments dealing with returning veterans, was unprepared for this challenge. Programs existed to address physical injuries, but psychological trauma received minimal attention. Veterans were expected to reintegrate quietly, to put their service behind them and resume normal civilian lives. For many, this proved impossible. The predators they had become in Vietnamese jungles couldn't transform back into civilians simply because the war had ended. Was this transformation worth the tactical results achieved? From a military perspective focused purely on mission accomplishment, the answer is clearly yes. Australian SAS neutralized enemy units, gathered intelligence that saved countless Allied lives, and demonstrated that warfare could be prosecuted effectively through small unit operations that emphasized skill over firepower. From a human perspective concerned with the welfare of the men who served, the answer becomes more complex. These soldiers proved that elite forces could achieve remarkable results through rigorous selection and training. They demonstrated that sometimes the most effective approach to warfare is the opposite of what conventional doctrine suggests. But they also proved that creating warriors capable of such effectiveness requires psychological changes that don't reverse when the war ends, transformations that exact long-term costs on the men who undergo them. The lesson for modern military forces isn't that we should simply copy Australian SAS methods from Vietnam. The contexts differ too greatly. Modern special operations face different enemies in different environments with different constraints. What worked perfectly in Vietnamese jungles might fail completely in Middle Eastern deserts or urban environments. The real lesson is more subtle and perhaps more important. Effectiveness in warfare requires matching tactics to terrain, culture to context, and methods to available resources. The most powerful military in the world cannot always solve problems through overwhelming firepower. Sometimes, perhaps often, the solution requires smaller forces with deeper skills, patience instead of aggression, psychological operations instead of physical destruction. The Australians understood something that American doctrine struggled to acknowledge during Vietnam. Warfare is fundamentally human. Technology matters. Firepower matters. But understanding your enemy, your terrain, and yourself matters more. They proved that 50 men who truly understand what they're doing can achieve more than 500 who are simply executing doctrine without deeper comprehension. They demonstrated that patience, properly applied, is a weapon as deadly as any bomb. That intelligence gathered through careful observation is more valuable than enemy casualties inflicted through random contact. That breaking enemy will to fight is more effective than destroying enemy capability to fight. That sometimes the best way to fight a war is to become invisible, to hunt rather than to battle, to strike only when conditions guarantee success, rather than engaging whenever contact occurs. And they showed that the price of becoming elite isn't measured in training hours, equipment costs, or operational budgets. It's measured in the psychological transformation required to hunt other humans with the patience and skill of apex predators in the ability to commit violence without hesitation or regret, in the willingness to become something other than a normal human being for the duration of service. Some men made this transformation and returned relatively intact. Others paid prices that would affect them for the rest of their lives. All of them deserve recognition for what they achieved and understanding for what it cost them. When the last Australian SAS operators departed Vietnam in October 1971, they left behind a record that military historians would study for decades. They had proven conventional wisdom wrong, demonstrated that elite status isn't granted by equipment or budget, but earned through selection, training, and the willingness to transform oneself completely for mission accomplishment. The Maytao Mountains, once considered forbidden territory where American forces feared to operate, had been dominated by fewer than 150 Australians who understood that effective warfare isn't about who has the most firepower, but about who uses available resources most intelligently. They became Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, and in becoming ghosts, they proved that sometimes the most effective warrior is the one the enemy never sees until it's too late. The Americans thought they were elite. The Australians didn't need to claim elite status. They simply demonstrated it through results. And in warfare, as in most things that matter, results are the only measure that ultimately counts. The methods may be studied and debated. The ethics may be questioned. The long-term costs may outweigh the short-term benefits, but the effectiveness cannot be denied. This is the uncomfortable truth that the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam forces us to confront, that creating truly elite warriors requires transforming human beings in ways that extract permanent psychological costs, that the most effective approaches to warfare are often those that conventional doctrine dismisses, and that sometimes a small force of exceptional individuals can achieve what massive conventional forces cannot. Whether that knowledge makes us wiser or simply more aware of warfare's true complexity remains a question each observer must answer for themselves.